Hey, DawgNation, my name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. It is a unfortunately busy day for us with some of the kind of news that we don't love talking about around here. Obviously, five-star defensive tackle Bear Alexander decommitted from Georgia yesterday, fresh off a Texas A&M visit. It was on the heels of his Georgia visit. What does all of it mean? You know, this is kind of in line with what we've kind of been saying about the difficult nature of this recruitment, but the news may not be all bad. There may be still an opportunity for Georgia here. We will dive into that and cover it all. And plus the latest twists and turns with all the kind of the after effects of this, what it means for UGA recruiting. And we'll try to deal with it all. Connor Riley going to be here today too. So we're busy, plenty to talk about. Glad to have you with us as we do it. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by ESOG, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Say it ain't so, Bear. Say it ain't so. We got some not so great news yesterday. We're going to try to cover it here over the course of the next few minutes. Five-star defensive tackle Bear Alexander announcing his decommitment from the University of Georgia. Let's see if we can kind of go through the timeline and all of this, and then that'll kind of set us up for what we need to say after that, which is kind of what happens now. First of all, it seemed like it was just all going so well, right? I mean, Jeff Sentell had been on the show talking about Bear Alexander a lot over the course of the last few months. Alexander takes his visit to UGA here this weekend. After the visit is done, you clearly couldn't have a recruit, especially one on the top shelf of talent the way that Alexander is. You couldn't have a guy like that saying things about Georgia the way that Alexander said, and you know, most Georgia fans would have kind of come away from that thinking, oh, this sounds really good. I don't play this to mock Alexander and his choice. I share this with you because we need proper context for everything that has gone on here. But fresh off the visit to UGA, Alexander was raving about the Dogs and really envisioning himself as being a student on this campus, member of this team in the very, very near future. This is Alexander with Jeff Sentell from over the weekend.
What sticks with you about that trip?
That I know that I'll be there in 5 months. I mean, it was a great trip being around family and knowing that this place is a place that's going to be home very soon. It got me knowing that this is going to be the place I'm going to go to. Then kind of just like, it put everything over the edge. Like, I already knew it was a good place, and they just kind of made it feel even more homey, gave me more home vibes.
I mean, you really couldn't have written a script better for a recruit to say of, hey, this place gave me great, as he says, home vibes. I like that phrase, and I know I'm going to be here 5 months from right now. In fact, he went into even more detail than that about kind of what his conversation was behind the scene with Georgia coaches after that visit that he just took. A little more from Bear Alexander with our Jeff Sentell.
Do you already feel like a Bulldog?
I do. And then me and Coach Landon, like, we met before I left. He was like, you've been loyal than most think. Like, yeah, I feel like a dog already. But like I was just telling Coach Smart, had red, black, and white run through my veins.
So once again, he says the red, black, and he says the white running through my veins. The coach is saying that you've been more loyal than some people might realize, and everything sounds really good there. And then, if I had a record scratch sound effect, this would be the moment when that happens, because after all of that, yesterday, Alexander on social media shared a very different message. I'll show you this on the screen, read for you a couple of sentences. Many of you have kind of already seen that. He says, I'm blessed and appreciative of the opportunities that Georgia offered me to be a part of the Bulldog family, but the landscape has changed tremendously since I last visited with schools, and though still one of my top choices, I'm decommitting from Georgia and reopening my recruiting, he says. Wow, what an about-face from Alexander after having been at Georgia, raved at Georgia, seemingly validating the UGA commitment that he had made. and then all of a sudden changing his mind. And as many of you know, because we talked about this on yesterday's show, the kind of intervening moment in between the tweet you just saw and the comments that Alexander gave upon having visited Georgia was a trip to College Station, Texas, in his home state of Texas, to visit the Texas A&M Aggies. After all of that was said to Jeff Sentell, and I guess you kind of put all this together, it was that visit to Texas A&M that caused Alexander, from the Aggies' perspective, to see the light, or from the Georgia perspective, to, I guess, rethink his relationship with Georgia. Yesterday, Jeff Sentell, our DawgNation recruiting insider, was good enough to spend a few minutes on video sharing his thoughts about what all of this meant, and here was the way that he described the way that Alexander now views his recruitment after now being a guy on the open market again officially after decommitting from Georgia. This is Jeff Sentell.
I think what we should learn right now is that, like, all of these guys are really basically hitting the reset button on their recruitment. I still think there's good reason for Big Bear Alexander to come back to Georgia, but I think he's just going to do the search and discovery process all over again. It was almost like his recruiting process, which led him to commit to Georgia and stay loyal to Georgia until June, was kind of like the preseason or the exhibition part of his recruiting. And now, when things are really going to start to matter, when he goes on these visits, he's going to find out where exactly he wants to be and needs to be and feels led to be.
So listen, here's the thing. And I know this kind of landed with some people in kind of a, odd way. They're irritated by this, that the guy would say one thing and then his actions would do something else. And there's been a little criticism of all of this. I've got to make my point on the Alexander situation really, really clear. I mean, this is a guy that I have desperately wanted to be in Georgia's 2022 class. I'm a Georgia fan. I got a Georgia shirt on. We do this show from the perspective of a fan, and I would say that as a fan, Alexander is a player that I have very much wanted to be in Georgia's 2022 class. And I've told you all before, and I've said this, unfortunately, for months, and it wasn't my intent to be like a wet blanket or something along those lines, but I obviously viewed this as a really challenging recruiting. Not because of any kind of modern wrinkle that makes this more difficult than previous recruitments. This is actually kind of an old school story. It's one thing to go into Arizona and get Keely Ringo. There's no obvious home court advantage for Ringo services, a 5-star defensive back. It's another thing to go into Nevada and get Darnell Washington. There's no home court advantage for a big football power when you do that. Georgia's recruited nationally plenty and gotten plenty of 5-stars out of that. But it's very different to go into a state like Texas that has big established programs. Even if the state of Texas football has been down a little bit over the course of the last few years, these are still big brands within the Lone Star State. This is just a more challenging recruitment than some of the national battles that Georgia has kind of waged in the past, and that's why I've been, I don't want to say skeptical of Alexander's commitment, but knowing, and I said this to Jeff Sentell on Friday, many of you remember me saying this, that this was just a recruitment that Georgia was going to have to kind of roll up its sleeves and sort of go to the wall for wall, pillar and post, and battle if they wanted to win Alexander's recruitment when it's all said and done. So unfortunately, this kind of feels like something we've been talking about here for a while. But ultimately, while I am disappointed that Alexander is now back on the open market, I can't really be mad about this either at Alexander or at Georgia. Let me start with the Georgia part of this, and I'll tell you why. There are moments from time to time when your national recruitment could cost you somebody else that you could have maybe had an easier recruiting battle with. I'll give you, for instance, on this. And who knows how true this is, but it certainly seems like a couple of cycles ago when Georgia was paying so much attention to a running back like Zach Evans, that really hurt their chances of winning with a recruit and a running back like Tank Bigsby, who ended up going to Auburn. It seems like he didn't really quite feel as much love as he wanted to from Georgia, and so therefore he ends up at Auburn. Georgia kind of put its love towards Evans, who, as it turns out, may not have been able to, who really even knows what, but that seems to be an example of, maybe that national recruitment cost you with somebody else. In this case, though, when it comes to pursuing Alexander, it certainly doesn't seem like there's an obvious negative to Georgia having spent so much time with Alexander. First of all, Alexander is a very unique player following the footsteps of Jordan Davis. There aren't a lot of really athletic nose guard, interior style defensive tackles. Georgia's pursuit of Bear Alexander has made sense up until now. It's going to continue beyond the decommitment from yesterday. That kind of makes sense too, because this is a pretty rare prospect. And when you look at Georgia's relationship with other defensive linemen, it doesn't seem like that's waned very much. I mean, you've all the big names we talk about all the time, they still seem to be either having just taken Georgia visits. In some cases, there are other visits taking place for other big names here. I can't think of a defensive line recruit right now who Georgia's relationship has been injured with because it has spent so much time with Bear Alexander. Alexander is a recruit that's worth the time, and it doesn't seem to have hurt Georgia with any other player. So essentially, no harm, no foul when it comes to that. Also on the Alexander side, I'm not going to be, as Terrence Edwards has said on our show before, the old man sitting on the porch and mad at Alexander that somehow he's not honoring his commitment to UGA. Because to me, there's a degree to that which is unfair. And listen, I've told y'all before that if I was like king of college football or the czar over the sport, I wouldn't have Wild West transfer portal. And I'm not quite so sure I'd be quite as in love with name, image, likeness stuff the way that, some in the media seem to be right now. I would be very much a traditionalist when it comes to stuff like that, even though it somewhat restricts the freedoms of the players who play the game. But as a flip side of that coin, the one place where I do want to see players exercise the full measure of their freedom is while they're making their college choice. I do think they ought to be deliberate about that process. And I do think they ought to use everything as to their advantage to make sure they're making the best choice that's available for them. The 2021 guys who just signed didn't have the benefit of visits to be able to take, and who knows how good their decisions are ultimately going to be viewed to be based on the fact they didn't have that at their disposal. In the case of Bayer, if he wants to take visits as an uncommitted prospect, frankly, I don't necessarily think that's such a bad idea. I bet you probably do get a better visit experience when someone believes that you really are on the open market and they have a chance to win your services, whether it's the in-state pull of Texas A&M or some other visit that Alexander might take. I'm actually not that mad at what I assume his reasoning to be for wanting to be a decommitted player here and kind of a player that's at least, figuratively, thought to be back on the open market again. I mean, listen, I'm disappointed that he's decommitted from Georgia because I really want him to be here. But this is the process that he's going through. Frankly, I think he may be taking a more wide-eyed and more mature approach to his recruitment than some other guys do who kind of jump pretty quick with maybe not knowing the full measure of what it is that they're jumping into. And the third reason why, while I am disappointed that Alexander is no longer a member of Georgia's 2022 class, I can't quite be all that mad about it, is because I am still very much of the belief of something that Jeff Sentell mentioned a moment ago, that Georgia, I believe, will remain a key factor in Alexander's recruitment. Will it be easy to get that signature? Of course it won't. But the fact that Alexander is decommitted, I actually don't think makes it any more difficult for Georgia than it was already going to be because, let's face it, commit, decommit, silent commit, all these phrases that we use, these are all unofficial designations anyway. This was always going to be a recruiting battle that was going to go until the very final moment. And, we're in kind of NBA playoff time right now. You've heard it said before that a playoff series doesn't begin until somebody wins a game on the opposing, basically like until the road team wins a game on somebody else's floor. Or you've heard it said about the Masters that the event itself doesn't begin until the back nine on Sunday. That's kind of what Jeff Sentell said a moment ago there, that all the stuff with Alexander up until now has just kind of been the preseason nature of his recruitment, and the real recruiting may still not have really started. This may be still more of a fall thing heading towards the winter before you're ultimately kind of all said and done with this. But as Jeff Sentell said, this is still maybe a battle that Georgia can win. And by the way, it's not only Jeff Sentell who's saying that. Denylon Moore said, UGA wide receiver commit, a player that a lot of Georgia fans have really grown to enjoy and like. Well, if you liked him before, you'll like him even more now because of what he put on social media over the course of the last 24 hours. And I take this somewhat seriously. I won't count this as a prophecy, something that's guaranteed to come true, but I do take it seriously as something that can happen. Let me show you Denylon Moore said on the screen here. He says, don't worry about that loss. We're about to get it back. So Morissette seems to be pretty confident related to all of that. And who am I to argue with Denylon Morissette when it comes to that? So here's the summary of all of this. I still very much view Georgia to be a player for Bear Alexander. Do I view Texas A&M to be a player for Alexander's services? Yes, I do. The decommitment doesn't make that so. That was already true before all of this. This is a battle. It's going to go down to the wire. Recruiting is not for the faint of heart. If you get your feelings hurt easily, this is not the thing for you because, in the SEC, teams throw elbows and there's aggressive tactics and everything else. But if you want to be at the best, you have to recruit the best and you have to tolerate everything that goes along with that. This is another example of that. Fun story to follow. We will continue to do that here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ESOG. And as I said, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Great to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We are normally on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. A little bit of a radio hiatus for us, but we are looking forward to being back on the radio. That's going to happen in a few days' time, and I'll explain why coming up soon. We actually have some pre-recorded vacation shows that are going to happen next week, and these are going to be great shows. I'm going to tell you more about that at the time. So I think the target is for us to be back on 960 The Ref after vacation, which I'm really, really looking forward to. So we'll talk more about that at the time. Of course, podcast, Apple, Spotify, Google, worldfamousdognation.com, SoundCloud, just so many different ways to listen to the show. Really appreciate you doing that. And a huge thanks to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for making it all possible. When it comes to foundation waterproofing issues, these are significant things that homeowners think a lot about. Well, no matter how much you may have thought about this when it comes to your own home, I can promise you this, the folks at ESOG have thought about it even more for not just your home, but homes all across the metro Atlanta area and the state of Georgia. This is the thing they have dedicated their life to working in. They've hired smart people to help you figure it all out. 2 full-time engineers on staff. I can heartily recommend them because I know how much expertise goes into the work that they do. Plus, it's also just kind of fun to do business with them. Many of you are so gracious to support the sponsors who support this show, and our buddies at Engineered Solutions of Georgia have been with us for a long time. They're also proud partners of UGA there as well. Jay Easton, one of the founding partners there from Engineered Solutions of Georgia, has explained to us before why they love making sure they get their service in front of as many Georgia fans as possible, because they know that Georgia folks are good to do business with, and you've certainly proven that to them over and over again. So if you're needing to kind of get some waterproofing stuff figured out, you see some water creeping in or you notice some cracks in your walls, go ahead and get that taken care of. Give them a call. Very easy number to remember. It's 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, we're going to do Connor Riley here in a couple of minutes. Connor, I'm sure, has got a lot to say about the Bear Alexander situation from yesterday, and I'll be curious to see how much of what Connor says mirrors what I just said, that this is always going to be a tough recruitment. This is still a battle that Georgia can win, but right now you do have to take Texas A&M pretty seriously as a recruiting power, not just for the couple of head-to-head names that we've kind of mentioned here before, but they're A&M right now is recruiting better than most of the teams in the SEC. Not better than Georgia, not better than Alabama, but better than most of the rest. Fairly consistently now for the last couple of cycles, that's been kind of true. So we'll do a lot of that here coming up in just a little bit, though. Before that, though, let's go around the doghouse. And I kind of want to follow up the discussion about Alexander with kind of an obvious question that comes next. Well, what about another Georgia commit that was also seen at Texas A&M here this weekend, Deion Smoke Bowie, who happens to be from Bainbridge, Georgia. That's the hometown of Kirby Smart, but it's also, as many of you are aware, the hometown of Nick Williams, the former Georgia staffer, which recently, in kind of a high-profile way, was hired away by Texas A&M. Big bucks seemingly spent to move Williams from Athens to College Station, and with Alexander visiting Texas A&M, then decommitting from Georgia, there has been some wonder of, what does this put Bowie's relationship with UGA, or maybe better said, the opposite, UGA's relationship with Bowie? Is this threatened, called into question after what Bear Alexander did? When Jeff Sentell showed up yesterday on the DawgNation video channels, he also tried to shed some light on some of that. This is Jeff on Smoke Bowie here.
So Deion was there with Big Bear Alexander. Prior to that visit, he said he's still locked in with Georgia. And he said he was going to take the visit and go check it out, largely out of respect to Nick Williams, who's out of Bainbridge, Georgia, the same hometown where he's grown up and was basically his primary recruiter at Georgia. Deion Bowie also is going to probably visit Alabama. He's going to take a lot of his visits, but as of now, he still remains very locked in with Georgia.
And obviously the phrase that jumps out is the as of now, because we are in an age in which this particular moment in the recruiting cycle, after these guys have not had a chance to take visits, in some cases there are a lot of 2022s who have not really had very much opportunity to take much in the way of visits at all, because not only have they not been able to take visits until just now, June, ahead of their senior year, but they didn't take visits a year ago either. So a lot of these guys are experiencing something that in large measure they've never really experienced before. And when you take these visits and you hear all these things, you're going to hear all kinds of stuff that makes you kind of reconsider your process and where things stand. And listen, for the guys you hope to hold on to in this 2022 class, there could be a couple of harrowing moments related to all of this. But like the one thing I feel the need to remind you is this is what recruiting was like prior to the pandemic. This is the way it always has been. There has always been this thing of you get the early 5-star, you hold on to him, and you sort of have to fight everybody off every step of the way after that. And obviously, given the fact that Bowie's a Georgian, he's from Kirby Smart's hometown, does, that give Georgia a leg up here? It very well might. But this is the way this has kind of always been. Last year was the weird year where you had, all kinds of pandemic stuff going on, and maybe the impact of the recruiting class felt a little bit different. But this is just sort of recruiting the way it's always been. The other thing that has come up here, and I've seen a lot of these comments both to me on Twitter and Jeff Sintel's video yesterday. What is all of this, the fact that Bowie was in College Station, the fact that Alexander was there too and ultimately decommitted from Georgia, does this mean that Georgia should have worked a little harder to try to keep Nick Williams on staff as opposed to letting Williams go and be at College Station? And this is where I'm forced to do nothing but speculate. While Williams is certainly a valuable recruiting asset, he was to Georgia, and he may be now for Texas A&M, and he could have been a factor, certainly was a factor in why Alexander and Bowie just took the Texas A&M visit, and could have been, because we know that his relationship with Alexander is pretty strong, could have been a factor in what led to Alexander's decommitment from Georgia. The fact of the matter is, I'm guessing that Nick Williams sees himself more as kind of a hired gun mercenary for these SEC staffs. My guess is that he wants to be an on-field coach here pretty soon. And if you've been at Georgia and you look at the situation at Georgia right now, there are no on-field coaching spots available, and you're thinking about your own professional development. It's not just money to go be a recruiting guy for Texas A&M. It's about also kind of moving around and developing those network connections that allow you your chance to become an on-field coach. So, it could be that this was more than just Williams taking a payday to go to Texas A&M. He could see this as maybe a more clear path to eventually being an on-field coach somewhere in the SEC. I think you've at least got to consider all of that, but there's no doubt that his name, the former Georgia staffer, now at Texas A&M, will be mentioned a lot in relationship to these recruitments and kind of wherever else all this goes from there. So we will let all of that play out. That is Around the Doghouse. Very quickly here before I say hello to Connor Riley, we do a Kroger Fresh Take with him. Let me also say thanks to our friends at Meriwether and Tharp being a big part of what we do here. Your source for Georgia divorce. You can find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. Free resources, all kinds of ways for you to educate yourself about the divorce process, to find out if that's the appropriate next step for you. You can get that online from our friends at Meriwether and Tharp, theatlantadivorceteam.com. Get that free initial consultation with them, and then after that, you can put them to work for you to help make the next phase of your life better, more enjoyable than the current phase might be. Theatlantadivorceteam.com. More details on that there with our friends at Meriwether and Tharp. All right, there is other big recruiting news around the SEC. We will touch on that before we're done on the show today, but for now, everything related to Bear Alexander and related to whatever may be going on with the rest of these big visitors this weekend and guys visiting elsewhere. Let's do a Kroger Fresh Take with Connor Riley right now here on DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So a big day yesterday for news, unfortunately not the good kind. And listen, sometimes it's going to be the other kind, and we have to cover that there as well. So Connor, Kroger Fresh Take with you. I'll bring you in on this. As I said, I'm not that mad about this. I don't think the decommitment changes much about what I already thought was going to be a really contested recruitment. This, to me, is as challenging a recruiting battle as Georgia has tried to win under Kirby Smart for a number of reasons. Doesn't mean they can't win it. I would say that Georgia still has a pretty good chance to win it because the stuff that Alexander said in the clips I just played, they still meant something, even if they didn't quite mean what they, in plain text would seem to mean, obviously just ahead of what turned out to be a decommitment. But this to me is Alexander deliberate about his process. I don't mind him doing that. Georgia going hardcore for a recruitment that's hard to win. There doesn't seem to be much downside for Georgia doing that. I'm disappointed, but I'm not angry about this.
I think your reaction is very similar to the iconic Alonzo Mourning gif where you're sitting there smoldering, then you're like, Well, he either Georgia can end up winning him back, or he can go to Brandon's second favorite team, Texas A&M, and continue to help them as they try to again make BA look better and smarter, as we all know him to be.
Yeah, don't do that. I can't do that. I mean, listen, these recruiting battles are dramatic because they're worth it. Bear Alexander is an incredible, valuable commodity. When you look at what Jordan Davis has done for Georgia, it is no small thing to say, oh, Alexander could be the next in line of the Jordan Davis type player at Georgia. That's a recruiting battle that you roll up your sleeves and you get involved with. Most schools in the country couldn't even be a part of this. So the fact that Georgia is going to have to fight longer to try to, earn this from Alexander, I mean, this is just kind of what it is.
I think the thing that really draws my attention with this Bear Alexander situation, and the Dayon Bowie one as well, is something you touched on a little bit there briefly, but I want to explore more, is why did Nick Williams leave? Because I think at the end of the day, wherever Williams ends up, and I would not be surprised in the slightest if he gets hired in an on-field coaching role as soon as this next coming hiring cycle, he clearly has significant sway with recruits, and we knew that even beforehand. That's why we wrote about why this was a significant loss for the Georgia program. And you need players like Bear Alexander and Dayon Bowie on your team to win national titles. And if Texas A&M is able to go out and hire that when you already have that guy in-house, I'm very curious as to what set of circumstances allow that to happen with Williams.
And I said this before, this is total speculation on my part, but it's speculation that I'm willing to make, that Williams could have been motivated to leave for reasons that had nothing to do with money, because Georgia could easily match the money, and they don't necessarily mean that he was dissatisfied at Georgia. Listen, we have a lot of young people who listen to our show. You're kind of entering the job market, or you're fresh and new in the job market. Your professional contacts, your networking opportunities are everything for you as you try to move up the professional ladder. And if you've been at Georgia for a few years, there's kind of a log jam of assistant coaches there. He's even moved position groups while at Georgia to try to, I think, learn a little bit more about what's going on there, working with defensive line most recently. You're doing everything you can to kind of move up the coaching ladder, but these Georgia assistant coaching jobs just don't come open very, very frequently. So he could have been motivated just to go try somewhere else to see if he could meet some new people and see if kind of reshuffling his own professional deck kind of creates a better opportunity for him to find, an on-field coaching job. That's my speculation. I have nothing to base that on other than kind of knowing how life works and assuming this situation might not be too dissimilar to other young people in other walks of their own professional lives.
So where I push back on that a little bit, though, is, we both expect Dan Lanning to not be around Georgia for much longer. It was a very real fact that he was going to potentially be the defensive coordinator at Texas as early as this season. And so, there was, I think, and again, this is, as you say, all speculation. I think there was maybe a path forward for Williams, but then you look at Georgia maybe going out and adding a guy like Will Muschamp. And I believe Muschamp's brother is also an assistant on Georgia's support staff there. And so you just wonder, is maybe losing Nick Williams the sort of tax, so to speak, that comes with bringing in an analyst like Will Muschamp?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question, and I think it's interesting the way that you said that, because for as much as we'll talk about Williams a lot in the manner of these recruitments, and we'll see how much more the Bowie thing even becomes a factor, but assuming that it does, we'll talk about Williams in that story there as well, because he's also from Bainbridge. But as much as Williams is going to become a famous name in this recruitment, he's not even the most famous defensive analyst at Georgia, which is kind of a pretty tough spot to be, because let's say that Lanning had become Kansas head coach. Well, it's not even obvious that Glenn Schumann, who would seem to be next in line for defensive coordinator, it's not even obvious he would have gotten that job had Muschamp wanted it. And so the way in which you kind of move up the ladder professionally at Georgia is just really, really hard. And all this is assuming and all this is speculation. But if you're Williams and you say, I'm not mad at Georgia, I just need to go try my hand somewhere else, I kind of understand where that's coming from, and maybe there wasn't a reasonable amount of money that could have convinced him not to do that.
Yeah, and I think you do a great job of laying out the ideals of why Williams would want to try his hand elsewhere. And there is some similarities there with Kirby and Jimbo. They do have a working relationship. There's also another former Georgia staffer, Marshall Malchow, who is a higher up there at Texas A&M. James Coley is there as well. So there was some familiarity there at Texas A&M. And you brought up how well Texas A&M is recruiting. they're still only about running 4th or 5th in the SEC every season under Jimbo Fisher. So they clearly, I think, need to get better at recruiting, which is why I think they made a very targeted choice in bringing in a guy like Williams, who, as we saw this weekend, is already paying dividends with 2 of the top prospects in this 2022 recruiting cycle.
Yeah, so I mean, I think all of that's pretty interesting. I mean, and they have, last couple cycles been consistently, 6th, 7th, something along those lines. They've been,
in that, 6 to 8 range.
Yeah, which, I mean, there are a lot of SEC teams that kind of used to be there that would kind of love to get back there again. So, from that standpoint, I'd say they're doing pretty well. I mean, more just specifically, though, what would you say about the Alexander situation? If you want to, do the Bowie situation there as well, but specifically in the Alexander situation, this to me always felt like a challenge, but still a challenge that Georgia could emerge victorious in. Specifically when it comes to that, what would you say about it?
On today's June 8th?
Yeah.
I don't think he ends up in Georgia's class. I think this is just one of those things where Texas A&M was always going to be in it, and they were always going to make this difficult, and the set of circumstances, visits opening back up, him being allowed to go back and see that, him making his commitment without really seeing Georgia firsthand, I think all that, Williams as well, is going to conspire to him ultimately, I think, signing with Texas A&M.
Did you think that before he decommitted?
I felt... Out of a 6 out of 10, I thought there was still a really good chance that he was going to end up at Texas A&M, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and folks heard me say this on Friday. I mean, this has always been a recruiting battle. It was going to be really hard for Georgia. I don't know that a ton has changed for me related to the decommitment. I still think it's going to be a hard thing, and if you want great classes, you got to do hard things, and this is the kind of thing that Georgia should do. But beyond that, we'll talk about something different here in a moment. Unlike some other recruiting battles before where spending a bunch of time with one guy might have cost with somebody else, I don't really see an obvious defensive lineman who is likely to have gotten his feelings hurt by Georgia spending as much time with Alexander as they have. I mean, Mikael Williams is on campus this weekend. Travis Shaw has been quoted recently saying that he's got a plan to visit Georgia here coming up pretty soon. I'm assuming that even though Walter Nolan said what he said over the weekend, he may still do that as well. I'm having a hard time finding a defensive lineman that has seemed to disregard Georgia because of the time that it spent with Bear Alexander.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is because Georgia was planning on taking a ton of defensive linemen in this class anyway. Jeff Santel says as many as 5 guys could be in this class. So Georgia was already casting a wide net in that situation, looking for a variety of bodies. They already have Tyree West committed, though he was out visiting, I believe, Auburn this weekend. And you have Mikael Williams. Christian Miller is a name to know. I believe he's said to be at Georgia this week. Walter Nolan.
After being at Ohio State this past weekend.
Walter Nolan, though, if you think this Bear Alexander commitment is going to have a lot of twists and turns, Nolan is going to have even more than that. And then obviously Travis Shaw, a big one to watch out of North Carolina as well. So Georgia's defensive line recruiting is still, I think, in a very good spot overall, especially with some of these top prospects.
So beyond that, a lot of guys coming in, as you said, a lot of guys going other places there as well. It's kind of funny to see. Tyree West, I think, has visited multiple schools. You had, Oscar Delp and Kojo Antwi at Alabama before coming to Georgia, and probably other places there even as well.
Clemson.
Yeah, Clemson. What did you make of the comings and goings of the weekend and the really the last few days in general?
Yeah, the visits are tough right now in terms of just trying to keep track because everyone is going everywhere because they haven't really, especially these 2022 kids, haven't really been able to see anywhere yet. Mm-hmm. But the one thing I pay a lot of attention to and gave it and wrote about it on Monday, if Georgia is going to continue to be the offense that we think it's going to be in 2021, it needs to land the official visitors that were in town this weekend. Kojo Antwi, which is going to be another heated Texas A&M recruitment battle with Georgia right there. Oscar Delp, which is a national recruitment, even though Georgia, I think, does have a little bit of an edge with him being from West Forsyth High School there and coming Georgia. And then Branson Robinson, who was visiting from Mississippi. And I would throw in Addison Nichols as well on the offensive line there because Georgia's not going to appeal to a whole lot of top-ranked offensive linemen. So when it does have the attention of a I think he's the number 103 player in the class, and Nichols, you have to really win those recruiting battles, especially in the offensive line in this cycle. Georgia has to land those guys because for the 2021 class, I don't think Georgia did a great job in terms of bringing in skill talent. You've already seen Lavassier Carroll, the one running back commit, move to the defensive side of the ball. Adonai Mitchell, yes, he did play well in the spring game, but we can rattle off names that have played well in spring games before without really turning into a whole lot of production there. So Georgia, I think, needs to hit on their skill player targets in this class, and I think they had probably, in my opinion, certainly their top tight end target. Right now, their top running back target, and either their first or second wide receiver target in Antwi visiting this weekend.
And I have to say that for me right now, the Antwi visit is kind of the dog that isn't barking, because and you could also make a case that raving about your visit may not mean quite as much after what Barry Alexander just did. But you've got Oscar Delp saying all the things that he said, and Branson Robinson, who's certainly been full-throated in his praise of Georgia, both leading into his visit and post-visit. It seems like it's a little quiet on the Antwi front right now. He just doesn't seem to be, this is, speculation on my part, he doesn't seem to be as guided by emotion during his process. He doesn't seem to have the obvious affection for Georgia that some of these other guys, seem to have. Doesn't mean that Georgia won't win that recruitment. He's clearly close with a couple of UGA commits, but I would say that his scenario is a little bit more difficult to ascertain in comparison to some of these other recruits that we just mentioned, who are a lot more open about their love for UGA.
If Georgia wins the Antwi commitment, that's when you probably celebrate a little bit more. Celebrate a little bit harder. Not that you wouldn't celebrate a Delp or a Robinson. I'm sure we'll come on when those guys, I think, do eventually make their decision. I do think both those guys are going to end up at Georgia. Antwi will be a little special celebration just because, again, wide receiver, while, yes, Georgia did well in the 2019 class with Dominic Blaylock and George Pickens, and then the 5 wide receivers they signed in the 2020 class, Georgia still needs to, I think, prove it with these wide receivers. And so if they're able to do enough to land a guy like Antwi, a top 100 wide receiver, a sort of national prospect, I think that goes a long way for Georgia and what they're trying to build.
Antwi also just kind of seems to fit into an archetype of the Atlanta area high school product, and, Lambert's right there in Swanee, kind of at the Forsyth-Gwinnett border. This Atlanta area high school prospect that just doesn't seem to have that deep-seated love for Georgia the way that a guy from, say, Peach County. It's like you go farther away from Athens, you got guys who were more Georgia in their blood. Some of these Atlanta area guys just sometimes don't seem to have that because they're all kind of from somewhere else or whatever else. Antwi just sort of feels like the kind of guy we've talked about in the past, and sometimes the kind of guy that Georgia hasn't won with.
Yeah, I think it's well known Atlanta is a transient city. Myself, my parents moved down from New Jersey right before I was born, so it makes recruiting the Atlanta area difficult, and sometimes that can be frustrating when people talk about how Georgia recruits its own state. Recruiting the metro Atlanta area is like its own independent city-state. It is not this slam dunk thing. And Antwi, for example, he's got a brother that lives in, I believe, the Houston area.
That's right.
So it's not necessarily this clear-cut, he's from Georgia, he should end up going to play for the Bulldogs, like you see in states like Louisiana and Ohio. It is not that clear-cut, and I think this Antwi recruitment is just going to be another example of that.
Yeah, maybe so. All right, so it's our Kroger Fresh Take with Connor Riley here. And by the way, speaking of Kroger, they got a big push right now. Several positions available. So if you're looking for a job, Kroger, I can promise you, is a great place to work because it offers more than a paycheck. It offers a total rewards package, things like tuition reimbursement, associate discounts, also partner perks, so much more. They really do great things to take care of their employees. In fact, you can find that out yourself. Do me a favor, go to jobs.kroger.com. That's the website, jobs.kroger.com. Or stop by and see your local Kroger store today, and you can find out exactly what I'm talking about there as Kroger looks to stock the next generation of terrific Kroger employees. And my, oh my, they've had some great ones taking care of us over the last year and a half, and really for even longer than that. All right, so the other big news that's out there is the Brandon Turnage situation. Former Alabama defensive back transfers to Georgia. There are rumblings, reports, rumors, whatever else, that he's leaving Georgia. Turnage himself on Twitter shoots some of that down, says stop it with the rumors. Now we're kind of left to know where all this stands. Obviously, in the intervening time, Georgia's offered a defensive back out of Tulsa. Just sort of big picture, what does all this mean to you, Connor?
I think it's telling in terms of how Turnage viewed himself, whereas how some people viewed his addition. Because I think Turnage came to Georgia thinking there was going to be a chance he was going to start and play right away, because he was not given that opportunity to do that at Alabama. Did not play a whole lot in his first 2 years there, and there were people out there saying and parroting that this is going to be a guy that's going to come in and push for the starting cornerback position. I never saw it that way. I saw him as a replacement for Major Burns entering the transfer portal and going elsewhere. So then you add Darian Kendrick, a guy who has a clear-cut experience edge and is a much more known quantity than what Turnage is, and you can understand why Turnage might now be having second thoughts about coming to a place like Georgia, where, similar to Alabama, he saw himself get recruited over and passed over because of younger players or the school bringing in other players at certain positions. And so to see that happen to him again, literally, I think weeks after he announces he's coming to Georgia, you understand where these second thoughts come from. And then, I don't find it a coincidence that, after these rumblings sort of come out and then Turnage says, whoa, let's pump the brakes on this. They send an offer out to a Tulsa defensive back, Caleb Evans, who had already announced his top 5. And so and I wrote about it this morning. Georgia's secondary is not done. This is far from a finished product, and I know there were some in the national media saying, oh, well, Georgia's clearly shored up their biggest weakness. I think the additions of Darian Kendrick, Tyke Smith, and you can, as of right now, still include Brendan Turnage in that, they raise the ceiling of what this defensive back group can be. But in that first game against Clemson, which is a massive game for Georgia's season this year, the defensive back group still has the lowest floor of any position group, in my opinion, on this Georgia team.
Could be.
Just because communication is such a big thing back there, and we saw last year against Florida, if you don't have 5 guys playing together sort of on a string, it's a real challenge to defend elite passing attacks, and I still think Clemson is going to have that. So the Turnage thing, it's certainly something to watch. I think it's one of those situations where he saw himself as one way and Georgia saw him as another, and that seemed to have a conflict of ideals there.
And listen, I have great respect for the players who are going through all of this. As I said before, when it comes to Bear Alexander, I support his right to be deliberate about his process, make sure he's making the best decision. In the case of Turnage, and listen, I'd support, as a fan, I'd love for Brandon Turnage and cooler heads to prevail and Turnage end up on this roster because I think he's a good prospect. But as a player, you've got a responsibility to consider something else other than the best case scenario when you make a transfer move like this. If you're not starting in Alabama, the idea that it's going to be easy for you to slide over to Georgia, a roster that's essentially, at least measurably, almost just as deep as Alabama's, if Turnage thought that he was going to slide over and be a plug-and-play at Georgia, then he made a huge mistake in terms of how he read that situation. The fact of the matter is, he's not really all that distinguishable from the guys that Georgia already has. And I don't say that to disparage him because I'd like for Turnage, as a fan of this team, I'd like for Turnage to be here. But there has got to be some measure of personal responsibility to kind of know what you're getting into. I don't think that Turnage had a clear path towards starting, even if Darian Kendrick wasn't coming to the school, which obviously now he is.
Yeah, what's the difference between Keely Ringo and Brandon Turnage? What's the difference between Jalen, Kimber, and Brandon Turnage?
I would say very little. I mean, in the case of Jalen Kimber is actually the more interesting comparison because class of 2019, class of 2020, they're almost the same prospect.
Yeah.
Top 10 defensive back, top 100 recruit. They are very, very similar to the same prospect.
Yeah, and so you wonder why ruffle the feathers of, say, a Kimber or a Ringo and bring in a guy like Turnage when you've already sort of got something similar there where you've got young guys that are exciting prospects that have high upsides. You just need to get them that experience. Turnage didn't have that experience at Alabama, which is why I think of the transfers that Georgia has brought in, that is the most interesting. And even you look at a guy like Evans, the Tulsa defensive back. One, he had 23 career starts in his time at Tulsa, and while it's not a Power 5 level of experience, which Kirby Smart clearly values, playing in the AAC, there are certainly worse conferences you can play in. And do you know the last non-Power 5 transfer? And Jay Hayes doesn't count because Notre Dame is essentially a Power 5.
Right.
Do you know the last non-Power 5 transfer that Georgia brought in?
I'm assuming it might have been J.R. Reed, also from Tulsa, who became an AP All-American.
It was a Tulsa defensive back named J.R. Reed. So, again, Georgia's secondary is far from done here. I think the Evans offer is very interesting in the wake of the Turnage news and how that is all going to shake out.
Yeah, and listen, I think you're going to, and we'll wrap up with this, I think you're going to, whether Evans ultimately ends up coming to Georgia or not, I think you are going to see more of this in the transfer portal where at the American Athletic Conference level, there are a lot of really good offense in the American in addition to just being kind of a, pretty good league. It's almost like we talk about Power 5, Group of 5. The American Athletic Conference, I would say, is almost like its own separate thing, better than most of the rest of the Group of 5, and obviously just not, quite to the same level of the Power 5. But you're going to see these guys that play well at a Tulsa level that earn their way on to a bigger team than that. The Evans story, whether he ends up at Georgia or some program similar to Georgia, this is a lot of what the transfer portal is going to be. A couple of guys who really distinguish themselves at kind of a Group of 5 level who have a chance to move on to something bigger because of the way they play at a place like Tulsa.
Yeah, and again, you look at Evans' top 5 teams. Yeah, Jackson State is thrown in there, but you also have a Texas, a Missouri, and a Notre Dame. This is clearly a guy that has high power interest and a guy that I think a lot of schools think can come in and play at a high level next year. So it's going to be fascinating to watch how this Turnage situation ends up shaking out. But I think it just goes to show you that nothing is really set in stone when it comes to this new transfer portal, especially if Turnage himself never pulled his name out of the transfer portal where it has been speculated that's been the case, because then that allows him to essentially stay in there and remain in contact with other schools.
Yeah, it's really good. Connor, appreciate you being here. I know you got some great stuff coming up at DawgNation.com in the days ahead, and we'll, of course, look forward to talking about it here very soon as well.
As always, was a pleasure. Yeah.
Take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so good stuff there. A lot going on. And, I think for some people it kind of creates a little bit of angst because, you've got a lot of uncertainty, right? It's like, a guy like Turnage coming to Georgia, and maybe he's not, maybe he still is, maybe he's, maybe whatever. I think it's important not to, I guess, make more of some of this kind of stuff than it is. And, guys are trying to figure all their stuff out. I think the one thing, and this is not a good thing or a bad thing, this just is a thing. Like, the one thing that Georgia's not going to do is be held hostage by any player. The idea of, well, I'm mad, and so therefore I'm, going to do whatever else. I mean, Georgia's going to handle its business and make sure it's got a full roster. And obviously it's going to, create some opportunities for people. But if someone's not sure they want to take advantage of that, Georgia's not going to wait very long and looking to fill that spot with somebody else. And that's, like I said, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just true. So keep all of that in mind. Real quickly here, let me also say hello to our friends at Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. Great time this summer to get away, and there's no closer getaway, no better, great close getaway than what Harris provides, both at the original Harris Cherokee Casino Resort and the Harris Cherokee Valley River, both 2-hour drive from Atlanta. You got casino gaming floor, you got luxury spa, world-class dining, tremendous shopping opportunities. The Book is now open, sports gaming available in the mountains of western North Carolina, so it's all really fun and a great getaway, and it's 2 locations, the original and Harris Cherokee Valley River there as well. Check out this website, Caesars.com/Harris-Cherokee. You can find out a lot more. Caesars.com/Harris-Cherokee. All right, let's talk some recruiting here around the rest of the SEC for a moment, because a running back out of the state of Louisiana, Le'Veon Moss, has made his commitment to Alabama. He's out of Baton Rouge. He goes to Estroma High School there. I believe that's how you say that. Putting out on Twitter that he's leaving Baton Rouge to go to Alabama. And it's kind of interesting, the Alabama edit here, the graphic that was made for him upon committing to Alabama, kind of shows that Baton Rouge, Louisiana hometown. So there's no doubt that this is the kind of thing that LSU fans have noticed. There's been some message board chatter about that, but also the kind of thing that Alabama is liking to tout there as well, because for all the ways you want to measure the kind of unprecedented success that Alabama has enjoyed, I think one of the things that signifies that is the fact that they are the one school that fairly consistently goes into Louisiana and wins with big-time players. They find a way to go into Louisiana, win their share here. Moss may be the latest example of that. This is a pretty highly rated running back recruit. This is a top 100 recruit nationally, number 6 running back in the country there as well, out of the state of Louisiana. Obviously a little bit of a blow for an Ed Orgeron team a couple of years ago upon winning the SEC, winning in Tuscaloosa, winning the national championship, talking about how they were going to take it to Alabama in recruiting. It is fair to point out that thus far that has not occurred, that Alabama's recruiting has gotten stronger since having lost to LSU back in 2019. And LSU, in terms of holding on to the momentum or building on the momentum that was created by that game, they have not necessarily been able to do that. By the way, speaking of running backs leaving Alabama running backs around the Alabama program, you've also got an example of a running back leaving the Crimson Tide, moving on to the Texas Longhorns. Let me show you this on Twitter, the burnt orange of Keelan Robinson now, as Robinson leaves the Alabama program, moves on to Texas. This is interesting, obviously, because as Steve Sarkisian tries to build his program up in Austin, going to get players that he's familiar with from the Alabama program obviously makes some sense. Robinson, a former pretty big-time recruit there as well. But it also kind of, anytime you have a running back like this leaving one program to go to another, I think you're always left to kind of wonder what this means about the running back position at the school where he's leaving, at Alabama. And obviously, that's a pretty big question for the Crimson Tide going into the season, because Najee Harris, who had a very big year for the Crimson Tide a year ago, is no longer there. And it seems like it's finally Brian Robinson's turn. Robinson, pretty big recruit from, gosh, how many cycles has that been ago now? Was he a 2018 signee? He's been around for a while, it seems like. He's out of Tuscaloosa, former big-time recruit, finally getting his chance to do something there in the Alabama program. You got Jason McClellan, who's kind of around there as well. I guess some things may be expected from him. Who knows, maybe we hear from Trey Sanders this year too. But if Robinson is leaving Alabama, the assumption you probably make is, well, he must feel like there's enough in place in Tuscaloosa that it threatens his chance for playing time. And so how good will the Alabama running back situation be post Najee Harris? A transfer out sometimes makes you believe maybe that situation is looking a little deeper there than some might think. So that's probably worth, as you make that comparison. Right now, Georgia and Alabama aren't scheduled to play, but they could meet in the SEC championship. As you make that comparison between the two teams, what's going on for Alabama at running back is going to be a part of that. So Robinson out, at least this Robinson out, more opportunities for running backs coming in. And finally getting their chance to step up post Najee Harris there. One more thing. So Sam Pittman, we talked about the other day, Brad Davis, his offensive line coach, leaves, gets a big salary bump to move on to LSU. And it looks like as a response to that, Pittman's kind of reshuffling his staff a little bit. Instead of hiring an offensive line coach from out of the program, we'd kind of wondered if Randy Clements might be moving into that role after Clements had lost his job at Ole Miss because of what I think ends up being a little bit of a, kind of a personality conflict, a squabble with Lane Kiffin. Well, it's not Clements going to get this job. Looks like Pittman's going to move his tight ends coach over to offensive line and now look to replace an assistant coach at that spot instead of hiring a new offensive line coach. I'll just say this really briefly as Arkansas kind of shuffles its staff around here. I do think Arkansas is one of the more interesting teams in the SEC West this year. Now, I'm not probably as high on Arkansas right now as I was a year ago. You may remember around this time, I was really touting Arkansas for, their Vegas number, their season win total over-under was like 3.5, 4. I was really touting them to be over that number. As it turned out, they sailed over that number even with a shorter schedule. So that's one we kind of got right. I'm not probably quite as high on them for this year as I was a year ago, but I still think because of all the experienced starters they bring back, because for the most part they've held on to their coaching staff, obviously minus Davis here who's leaving for LSU, this is still a pretty tough out in the SEC West. And I think the thing you're kind of left to wonder is, it's like the line from Rounders, if you can't spot the sucker at the table, then you might be the sucker, and I'm sort of paraphrasing that line just a little bit. If you can't spot the easy win in the SEC West, then it may be that your team is the easy win, because there's a lot of fans especially, who really seem to believe in Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. Ole Miss's Vegas total right now is like 7.5. That's not a small win total for a program like that. But if they're going to be that good, they almost need Arkansas not to be very good. A lot of the analytics people and the gambling people seem to like Mississippi State a little bit. Y'all know I'm not a believer in Mike Leach, but there's this common thought out there that Leach has a big opportunity for like a second-year bump, better year over year than he was in his debut campaign last season. That obviously is a lot more difficult to be true if Arkansas is a viable threat with kind of an experienced roster. So in an SEC West that's already really deep, the question becomes, how good is your worst team? Because if your worst team is like a 500 level type team, then that obviously makes it much harder for the teams that are supposed to be above that in the pecking order there as well. And all of a sudden, these teams that are vying to have these pretty looking records and satisfy their fans and head towards a nice postseason destination in the SEC West right now, it's just not easy to guarantee those things because, I just gave you the three bottom feeders in the SEC West, and I mentioned first-year coach Auburn with Brian Harsin there as well. Finding that easy win in the SEC West, at least for some, in the eyes of some, may not be all that easy to do right now. Will make that your SEC through. And as we get ready to wrap up on today's show, let's do a golden shoe. Of course, we do our Gator Hater roll call here today, and this one not quite so, I guess, Gator-centric. But listen, as I said before, we really love those who help take care of our sponsors and show some love to them, those that have shown a lot of love to us. And so I am very susceptible to pandering when it comes to golden shoes and things like that. So let me show you the golden shoe winner today. Michael Gill writing this on Twitter. He says, "Hey, DawgNation Daily, I'm taking your word for it on my day off, and I'm going to share some progress report later on. Enjoying himself some Finnish long drink cranberry style. You love to see that. He gives you a hashtag DawgNation, a Go Dogs, a Finnish long drink, and a golden shoe. So yes, Michael, for your support of one of our sponsors, our friends at the Finnish long drink, we will make you the golden shoe winner for today. And for our Gator Hater countdown, How about 144 days from right now? Yeah, 144 days from right now, Georgia goes back to Jacksonville, gets a win of those lousy, stinking Gators. Can't wait to see that happen. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ESOG. We'll talk to you then, everybody. And on video, time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. Great to have you with us as you join us on Facebook, YouTube, everything else. Of course, great to have R.S. Andrews with us as well. Check him out online for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They'll show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. I can feel good about saying that to you. Find them online today, rsandrews.com. All right, we're going to try to do two things here, and these things are somewhat in conflict. As I mentioned before, we are getting ready for a really fun week of vacation shows next week. Some of that we have to get ready for right now. So we'll still have DawgNation Daily every day next week. We have some really, really good content coming for you next week. I think it's going to be really fun. And I can't wait to share it with you. We have to record some of that today. So that means we have to get off the air pretty early to be able to do all of that. Also, it's also kind of a big news day with the Alexander thing. So let's try to stay on task. Let's try to do some comments related to that story. And then we'll get off pretty quick after that. So short comments, but hopefully good use of your time. And we'll see if we can make all that work. On YouTube first. Brandon Griffin says, time for comments, time to stop arguing. I guess y'all been acting up over here on the YouTube side of things. There's no telling what y'all been saying. No telling what's been going on here. Paula Clark asks a good question. Paula says, what do you think if Georgia goes undefeated, loses close in the SEC championship, do they make the college football playoff? This is one of those things where I think if you're a Georgia fan, you have got to have your dukes up ready to fight over. Because the idea of what would that be? 12-1 Georgia. If it's a 12-1 Georgia that includes a win against Clemson and run the table in the SEC in the regular season, if it's, as you described it, a close loss in the SEC championship game, historically, that's the kind of thing that the College Football Playoff Selection Committee has wanted to exclude from the playoffs. But last year, they did put a conference championship loser in the playoff when they put in Notre Dame. And Georgia would obviously have what you would assume is a very strong data point with a victory against Clemson. I would suggest if that and this is obviously kind of sight unseen. Who knows how the world is, maybe different reality than it's described here in this hypothetical situation. But if a 12-1 Georgia with a win against Clemson was excluded from the playoff because of a close loss in the SEC championship, which you might assume was the defending national champion Alabama, but let's say even if it was just a highly rated team from the SEC West that was in Alabama, if that team got excluded from the playoff, then the playoff selection process, I would say, is just broken. And that would be one of the reasons why I would favor an expanded playoff, because you simply can't trust the committee to make the right decision. It's not because they're biased against Georgia or anything like that. I just believe, generally speaking, they don't like too many SEC teams in the playoff. But that's a system that's broken if that version of Georgia doesn't make the playoff. And frankly, I don't think it's a guarantee that they would. But boy, you would certainly hear a lot of gnashing of teeth coming from this show if that were the case. A lot of comments rolling in. I was going to read one. Now I can't find it. Bank 6 says he's going to be at the Georgia-Arkansas game. He's got his parking pass and ready to go. That's great to see. Dapper Dan says the difference between a guy being committed and hearing at other schools or not committed and open up for recruitment is big, since they are no longer recruiting others to join them as part of the class. Yeah, that may be the case. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know that the announced change in Alexander's status probably, changes all that much with the situation. The honest truth is the players themselves probably know a lot more about, what each other's situation is than we kind of know, because those of us who are media fans, things like that, we're sort of forced to lean on these very specific designations that actually don't have much tangible meaning. Commit, silent commit, decommit, everything like that. There's actually probably more of a spectrum of possibilities, and the players themselves probably know more about that than each other anyway. So the fact that Alexander was saying the right things about Georgia but still entertaining whatever Texas A&M was pitching at him, the recruits themselves have probably already known that. At least if I had to guess, that's what I would say is probably true. Let's see what else is going on here. Grundy also talking about Kamar Wheaton there at Alabama there as well. Yeah, big time ad from the class of 2021. So they've got a loaded running back situation for sure. Robert Barnes was also mentioning a moment ago about maybe Texas A&M won't be very good on the field this year, which will cause guys like Bear Alexander, Kojo Antwi, or anybody else kind of reconsider what they think of Texas A&M, and it very well could. Obviously, Alexander would be the hardest one to see reconsider that on the basis of a bad season because his pull to Texas A&M is about more than just kind of being the sort of hot name to know. There's a strong in-state pull there, and there's also a familial pull for Antwi there too. But obviously, Aggies not being very good certainly couldn't hurt things for Georgia. Let's see. Robert Barnes says the only way two SEC teams get in the playoffs if other teams lose 2 games. And listen, if that's the case, then we've got a broken system. I mean, and maybe the system is just broken. But if Notre Dame can get beaten up badly by Clemson and make the college football playoff a year ago, but the same opportunity doesn't exist for, what you have every reason to believe would be a better version of the SEC team, then we've just clearly got a broken system. We've got a system that is artificially trying to create the illusion of parity more so than, actually rewarding the 4 best teams. Let's see what else. Croking 1-23 says, I believe in Bayer. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue with Alexander, what kind of stings here a little bit is, in addition to being a really good player on the field, Alexander's one of these really big personalities off the field. I mean, there's a lot of people who really, with good reason, really like Alexander and, really want him to be a part of the Georgia class just because of what an, entertaining personality he seems to be. Gives great interviews, says good things, the cartoon character nickname type deal here. I mean, he's kind of, y'all know I like wrestling. This is kind of a made for, TV wrestling persona type thing. So, I mean, that's part of this is the fact that this is a personality that some Georgia fans feel like they've kind of gotten to know. And I'd say that Georgia's still involved in this recruitment going forward. Robert Hosea says, do I just read Robert Barnes' comments? Come on, Robert. I guess I did read a couple there in a row, but that's only because I just sort of looked down and happened to see them. Isaac Cruz says, with these new rules, is it possible to give players signing bonuses to commit to a school, kind of like the French fry money back? So I've said this a million times that I still am not quite sure how exactly the name, image, likeness rules are going to unfold in college football. But what you just described is, I believe, very unlikely to be a part of it. I mean, I think when it's all said and done, what you have right now is a situation where the schools themselves like the illusion that players are about to really cash in a big way. And you can come to this school and you can make so much money. We've got all these opportunities available for you. But the honest truth is, I just don't quite think it's going to play out quite that way. I just don't. And so, this thing of, well, I'm going to choose school A over school B because my ancillary financial benefits are so much greater here. I mean, even someone like, say, Nick Saban, who obviously wants every advantage that he can get, it's not like he's out there arguing for his state to create NIL laws that give him the chance to really do that. I mean, Saban talks all the time, or has talked before, about wanting there to be somewhat of a level playing field. And if Saban's saying that publicly, then you could assume that most of the other big coaches are kind of thinking something similar privately, that I don't think the Jimbos and the Kirbys and the Sabans and the coaches like that are really all that eager to use NIL stuff as a, for lack of a better phrase, bidding war to win recruiting battles. I don't think that's what they really want to do. And my guess is whatever name, image, likeness, money actually really ends up going to players will be something that's a little bit more evenly distributed. Not one of these things of, hey, I'm, like Johnny Manziel talked about making, he called it a decent living signing autographs. I sort of wonder how true that really is for a number of reasons. But this idea that you're going to have a Mansell level player who's making, 30 or 40, 50 extra $1,000 for playing football for that year in a way that most of the players are not, I just sort of get a sense that it might not be quite so much like that. But I'm also not really sure how it's going to play out. But like whatever the wildest case scenario, or if you're more a traditionalist, whatever the worst case scenario that exists in your mind, I don't believe that's what's going to happen in reality. I think the schools have done a pretty good job of convincing players that's what's going to happen. But this is not just another example of players really having a need for personal responsibility to not believe everything they're told. I mean, you got to have someone in your life who tells you the truth. And the people who want something from you are just going to be less likely to tell you the total truth. And so whatever they're telling you about, because we have a lot of, families of recruits that watch our show, whatever they're telling you about name, image, and likeness, I'm talking about all across the board here, I would certainly do your own research on that, is all I'm saying. Let's see what else. So Moose asking about the radio. Yeah, we're looking forward to being back on the radio again. Give me a few days, Moose, and for everybody else who's a normal radio listener. So we're going to have the rest of this week. I'm going to be gone next week. So we already were going to be off the radio next week, right? So that was already going to be a thing. So no radio this week, no radio next week. We will have pre-recorded shows, though. So we're not, DawgNation Daily is not going to be gone. I'm just going to personally not be here. So by the following Monday, because I talked to my friends yesterday, by the following Monday, I think that seems like a really good time to kind of reboot DawgNation Daily back again on 960 The Rest. So we're looking forward to doing that on Monday. And I'm sorry for the the technical frustrations there. But we're looking forward to being able to do that. Jackson and Ricky says there's talks of a 12-team playoff on Bleacher Report. What do you think? Yeah, I've heard some, chatter about that being back in the media again. I'm more in favor of an 8-team playoff than a 12-team playoff. I like the idea of expanded playoffs, but I also like the idea that, as it stands right now, you would be watching some conference championship games to see how a certain conference team performs in comparison to a different team from a different conference, and all of a sudden those games seem to mean a little bit more. I think if you expand to a 12-team playoff, I think there's some risk that, at least in my mind, those games would matter a little less. I have no interest whatsoever in including any Group of 5 team in the playoff discussion. I just don't think they're playoff worthy. You may have to do that for political reasons because you need the votes to expand the thing, because that's what a lot of this is really about. I don't mind giving automatic bids, though, to the Power 5 conference champions, because ultimately I want less power in the hands of the selection committee for the reasons I described a moment ago. I just don't think these people are worthy of the power they've been given. I think they use it poorly. And so automatic bids take that power away from them. But ultimately, the true value of an expanded playoff is going to be determined by, once you put conference champions in, and once you give your automatic bids in, and you take care of politically who you have to take care of, with the spots that are left over, whether it's 1 or 2 spots or 4 or 5 spots, whatever the number of spots that are left over, do you then put the 4 or 5 most deserving, or the 2 or 3, whatever the number is, do you put the most deserving at-large teams in the playoff? If you do, the playoff as a valuable sports entity can still be salvaged, because in most years, second best SEC team that is commonly sort of 5th best in the country, that's a team that can make some real damage and make some real noise in the playoffs. The national folks sometimes kind of pretend that's not the case because, as I said before, there's sort of an artificial attempt to create parity in college football. But whether it's A&M last year, Georgia in 2018, or unfortunately Alabama in 2017, whatever example you want to give, that second best team in the SEC, sort of 5th best team in the country, kind of either just in or just out of the playoff, that's usually a team that's playoff worthy. And to kind of be something other than just a total SEC homer here for a moment, I'd also say that second best team in the Big Ten East in many of these years is the kind of team that's a pretty tough out, pretty difficult team to try to beat when it comes to, whether it's Penn State in some year or it's some years. I mean, it's really been Ohio State left out of the playoffs a couple of times when maybe they had a playoff argument. In an expanded playoff, they're clearly getting in. That's a very tough team to beat. So if you put those at-large teams in, then they're going to work their way into the national semifinals. And all of a sudden now, after years and years and years of national semifinal games that have kind of been duds, all of a sudden now you've got better semifinal games because you've picked better teams to be in the playoff. I say this every single year, and I believe it's true. The problem with the blowout games in the playoffs is the committee picks the wrong teams to be in the playoff. They keep putting Notre Dame in, or undeserving Oklahoma teams. This year's Oklahoma team may turn out to be different, but they keep putting the wrong teams in the playoff, and so therefore they get blowout games, and that's just all there is to it. So to answer your question, that's kind of a long answer to a short question. I would favor an 8 over a 12, but for now, anything to me is better than a 4. All right, 1 or 2 more. Isaac Cruz says if they have a 12-team playoff, just hope they spread those games out so they could play on TV. That was hell for me to stream the Georgia Spring game. Yeah, I'm guessing they'll have a nice TV package related to all that, but I know a lot of folks did not like the spring game streaming. Back over here on YouTube. Bank 6 says an 8-team playoff this past year would have had 3 or 4 SEC teams, and I would absolutely trade my kingdom for a committee that was courageous enough to put the very best teams in the playoff, even if it was 3 teams from the same conference. As it stands right now, they are not going to do that. All right, we are about to go. Scott Harris says, if I'm not going to put group of 5 teams in, he says that means that Tennessee doesn't get to play for the playoff, which is very funny. Very good stuff. All right, last thing for sure. Moose Tame says, I missed the JP Sports. They had every UGA game on local TV. So, honesty compels me to admit that I don't think as many of those games were on TV as you might remember. I mean, we are actually in the golden age now in terms of games being televised. When I was a kid growing up back in the 80s, there were Georgia games all the time that weren't on TV. Now, part of that was because half the SEC was on probation and not allowed to be on TV. But there were a lot of Georgia games back then that weren't on TV. But I remember vividly I'm talking about the old days of the Jefferson Pilot. Like there was like a more kind of like newer version of like JP in like the years of not all that long ago, but like in the 80s, back when it was only a 10-team SEC. And they had the cartoon character show open where like all the SEC mascots were going to like sit around the boardroom table together and they're like fighting with each other. And there's like the Vanderbilt Commodore and the Georgia Bulldog. And I mean, you talk about a really, really cool thing for a kid to watch that sort of, cartoon SEC opening. That was probably the best we had for graphics back then. That was all really fun stuff. So I do remember the great old days of Jefferson. Excuse me. I'm hiccuping. But Jefferson Pilot, Bob Neal doing those games on play-by-play. Got a chance to know Bob a few years ago, and it was kind of funny to think that this is the guy that I watched, doing those games on TV for so many years. Of course, his son Dave has been doing SEC games for a long time there as well. So that is all really fun stuff. Thanks for being here for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down today. Really appreciate that. My invitation to you is to also check out what's going on at the AJC right now, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, online, ajc.com. Hawks tonight resume Game 2 in the Eastern Conference semifinals against the Philadelphia 76ers after really as an impressive a run as I've seen the Hawks go on. 5 of 6 thus far in the playoffs. Big lead, 70-something points in the first half against Philadelphia the other night. Of course, the Sixers do kind of come back on you a little bit there, but I don't think that changes the overall mood here, which was this was a very, very impressive start for the Atlanta Hawks in the second round of the playoffs. They look to keep that going against Philadelphia again here tonight there as well. Also, Braves getting back at it after a series win against the Los Angeles Dodgers that, frankly, I didn't really see coming. There's also aftermath of the Julio Jones trade and kind of the disappointing stuff related to that, but what Atlanta now does after kind of moving on for Julio Jones, and kind of interesting look from our buddy D-Lad at the bigger role that Kyle Pitts now gets a chance to play because Julio Jones is gone. This is good stuff from D-Lad, ajc.com for that there as well. Thank you for being here for R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Check them out online. That I tell you all the time, but that air conditioning tune-up, it's really a mega tune-up that can get your system back to factory fresh specs. Did you know it's only $99 there as well? So that's great savings. Find them online, rsandrews.com for more on that. We'll see you back here tomorrow, 10 a.m., DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We will look forward to talking to you then, everybody. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.